Perfect. All right. I am so excited for today's conversation. As you can see, I have a tiny guest joining us for today. Um, so I'm really thrilled to take a deep dive about this. And rural access has been a subject matter that's been spoken about so many times. And that's something that I really wanted to commit to and ensure that the conversation is actually happening inclusive of those from rural communities. So thank you so much for being here. And there have been certainly significant barriers facing rural communities, including access to bandwidth, access to infrastructure, support services, funding, transportation, support for entrepreneurs, just to name a few, right? And these challenges have been there for quite some time. It's not something that's new. It's not something that newly introduced itself. However, the pandemic certainly amplified it a lot more. And there have been several false promises that have been made on progress and implementation. However, not much action has been seen in those communities. So what actually needs to be done? What was missed, and how do rural communities build up from here? Before we dive in, I do want to acknowledge that I am virtually joining everyone from Ottawa, which is the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. And I myself acknowledge Canada's First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples, their histories and contributions throughout this country. And I will continue my journey in learning and unlearning as well. So I am joined by three audacious changemakers and entrepreneurs today. So I want to kickstart this by introducing Doreen Ashton Wagner, who's the founder and executive director of Business Sisters, Jackie Shoemaker Holmes, who's the CEO of Empowerment for Resilience, and of course, Shanna Steeles, who's an entrepreneur, a visual artist, and an educator. Thank you so much for being here virtually. It's awesome. So I want to start this conversation by asking you a very simple question or a statement that I'd like for you to finish. And perhaps, Doreen, you can kickstart this for us. So rural access means what to you?
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. And I also acknowledge that I'm coming to this conversation as a settler, and I am learning all about reconciliation and what we need to do. In the area where I'm located in Alexandria, we see rural access as, I believe, overcoming distance. And that is overcoming distance geographically, overcoming distance often technologically because of the lack of rural bandwidth, as you mentioned, and also overcoming distance as individuals because we don't have access to the same networks and proximity that would afford an entrepreneur in an urban setting. So I think, to me, access is overcoming distance.
I think that's such a wonderful point. That's the really obvious difference, isn't it, between urban and rural communities, is that access piece, transportation, outreach, support. So thank you so much for echoing that. Thanks, Doreen. All right, we'll go over to Jackie.
Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I feel very privileged to be here. Having this very important conversation. I do recognize myself as a settler on unceded territory. And what I want to say, I don't know if this is the answer that you're looking for, but I think, I really appreciated what Doreen had to say about distance, because I think that sometimes there is a distance or disconnect between ideas, right? And I think that can kind of play itself out along very interesting political lines when it comes to rural areas. And I think that sometimes we, in more rural areas, we miss out on that which is cutting edge. Because that which is cutting edge can be scary for areas that are steeped in conservatism, for example. So I guess that's what I want to say. I want to echo Doreen and say distance, but distance in terms of ideas.
Absolutely. Yay. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Janky. Amplifying is what I'm hearing so far from what you and Doreen have mentioned. Shanna.
Yes, thank you so much as well for inviting me to this conversation. It's so important. I feel like this is a conversation we've been having kind of around the virtual table with different colleagues over the last year or so with the different challenges coming up. And I echo as well the learning and unlearning of our settler histories. And I think that really taps into what I find rural access really, obviously what Doreen said and what Jackie said as well. And I think one part that we don't often consider is culture. That cultures are different depending on where you are from. Even though we're all in Eastern Ontario, it's very different across the line depending on what your history is, where you know what your history of settling is, and just how you've grown up. Different in Ottawa, different in Prescott Russell, where I am, and I know Doreen over in SDG Cornwall. They're slight, but they're big at the same time. So I think it's really recognizing that and also being able to have sensitivity to it and having a conversation about what those really mean and what it's looked like through the history as well, and different histories, because those do influence the way we live our lives out in where we are, you know, in a rural setting. And that plays into the idea of having the same opportunities to reach the full potential as those in urban centers, urban areas. So I think that's that conversation around that for me. That's what rural access means.
Wow, fantastic. I'm really glad that you brought up that point, Shanna. Oftentimes it's all encompassed into this one bubble, right? Rural is one thing, right? And it's really important to recognize, as you mentioned, that we're not all the same. All rural communities are not the same. Needs are different. Access means different things to different communities. So it's really great to point that out. So thank you so much for doing that. Since we're kind of in that conversation of access, one of the biggest gaps that we've seen has been access to healthcare and utilization of healthcare services, support services, just to name one example of healthcare services. And this gap has been growing and growing in rural communities, and of course been brought up as a huge concern when the pandemic hit. No transportation, online when bandwidth is an issue. So how do we provide access to support services such as mental health and wellness and support for those that have visible and invisible disabilities, right? So having that in our minds, what should be or should have been some of the top focus areas to really better support those who are seeking support services in the realm of mental health or wellness, or even those that are recognizing those that are having visible and invisible disabilities. So I would actually, maybe you can start, Jackie, if you don't mind kickstarting that for us, that would be great.
This is such a tricky question to answer, I think, because you know, we had these issues before the pandemic, right? Like we had, you know, issues of access and issues of quality and issues of the ability of people to navigate systems, right? For as long as the systems have existed. And so I am a very big proponent of having online access to a variety of individuals, right? Care providers, health providers, wellness providers, etc. As you say, that is contingent upon proper bandwidth, right? And so, what comes first? I mean, I think that's an important question, right? And I think that bandwidth is a question of rights, not just need.
Yeah, absolutely, Jackie. And to your point, yes, bandwidth has now it's actually seen as a basic right in communities. It's a universal right to have access to bandwidth, just as it's universal right to have access to healthcare and things like that. So, what should that actually look like in communities where that is a huge concern? Um, and there have been promises of ensuring there's access to Wi-Fi. However, the question is it equivalent to high-speed internet, or is it equivalent to how things were when internet was first introduced to the communities, right? So what does that access truly mean? And to your point, what is that quality? What is that quality going to look like in rural communities? So yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Doreen, if you like to kind of kickstart this first as well.
I promised myself I wouldn't do this, but you're on mute. Access is one thing, and we have access to high speed, reasonably good high speed, reasonably stable high speed. But there's the access of, from a financial point of view, it may be available, and I'm fortunate and privileged to be able to pay for it. But lots of families in our area are not. So it may be there, but they can't afford it. And we do have, certainly in North Glengarry, for instance, the median income is below that of what exists in the province compared to other rural areas as well. So it's a double-edged sword. It's a lack of availability in some spots. My neighbor down the road doesn't have high speed, but we do, because we happen to be on a hill and high enough to overlook the trees, and we can afford it. So it's very tricky. It's spotty, and the solutions are more complex than just flicking a switch and having high speed.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out as well, Doreen, in terms of it's not black and white in terms of access. It's so much complex than that. But I guess the question also can be is what can be done in order to subsidize access to bandwidth, because affordability, I think that was mentioned as well, right? Is the other question, is what happens to those who are not able to afford high-speed internet? What is the equitable practice that needs to be put in place to access services? Right. Absolutely. Thank you. Shanna.
Yes, I'd like to echo what Doreen was saying. Absolutely. Like, just for example, I live in Prescott Russell. I live in the Alfred area. So I'm an hour away from Ottawa, or about an hour and 15 from Montreal. So, I mean, access to urban areas, I mean, we still have to be able to get there. So that's transportation. I think that's going to come up in another question. Every time we've upgraded any of our technology, lo and behold, we'd have to upgrade the speed. And every time there's a cost to that. And I know, speaking with colleagues or friends that are in urban centers, that doesn't happen. It's just there. They just have access to it right away. And myself, coming at this conversation as a visual artist, as an educator where I teach, and during the pandemic, I brought my teaching online. Well, that becomes an issue, because I mean, I found a way to pivot to be able to teach online and to have students be able to see what I'm doing. But if their connection is spotty, then they're not really seeing detail in any of the video that I'm showing. So the quality of what they're getting is reduced, and then of course that doesn't make for a very good experience. So then what do you do? So then that means they don't have access again to things like art and to be able to express ourselves. And we saw during the pandemic how much art took such a front place, right? Because this is what has helped people get through it. When everything else was closed, what do we have? We have, our performing artists that were giving away free concerts. Now, how many people didn't have access to that? And I mean, I've seen it myself as an educator for almost 20 years now, the healing power of art and how art can help people during really difficult times. So if you don't have that small thing like as what we see today, very privileged, as a telephone line, to be able to hear that, then what happens to those people that kind of fall through the cracks like that? And it seems like such a small thing. Well, just pay $20 more. Well, that $20 is a difference between $20 in your gas tank to get to work and especially the prices that have gone up, or being able to actually just, visit with family or just watch that concert and feel uplifted and have that access. We come back to health, that access to feeling well. It's not even just access to somebody in particular to be able that we can see, but just our own mental health to feel okay, and that we'll get through that with that kind of that moral support that was there.
Yes, that's such a great point, Shanna, is really recognize the interconnectivity of what that tug and pull looks like, right? It's where does this go? What is the quality that I'm receiving? It's great that things are online, but what what does that mean to that individual as far as inclusive practices, and the quality of accessing wellness based services, like to be even able to have that as an option, for example. Absolutely, thank you. And Doreen, I noticed that you had your hand up there.
I didn't want us to lose sight of the fact that there are, as much as we can belabor the access and bandwidth and so on, one of the things I've witnessed in rural areas, and I don't have a point of comparison from an urban standpoint anymore, so you'll forgive me, but the whole mindset of community-based health supports. We're very, very fortunate in the Alexandria area. We have Glengarry Memorial Hospital. Near where Shanna is, there's Hawkesbury and so on. So we have our own small hospitals, and we latch on to them. I know we have neighbors from the province of Quebec who actually come to Ontario for emergency care because they perceive, and I do believe they're right, we have almost better access for emergency care. Having said that, what we've also witnessed and been very fortunate to have is community-based health supporting organizations step up. I'm thinking of, for instance, Beyond 21, which is a wonderful organization that supports adults with intellectual disabilities, autism, etc., and to continue living independently. And we have Glengarry Living, another community-based organization that runs several homes that do that. And we are so fortunate, and the community support around that is extremely personal. And I believe that our sparser population has made it such that we know one another and connect and support those organizations more vigorously. And that, I think, is a big plus. It doesn't mean that governments and other supports who should be there, need to absolve themselves of their responsibility here. But having said that, I think the community support we can be proud of and be thankful for.
Yeah, no, that's a spectacular point, Doreen, is really also recognizing the importance of allyship and community when, to your point, there are huge gaps. How do we come together as a community and really help elevate those gaps and really amplify those voices and come together and help each other out? So thank you so much for bringing that forward.
Welcome.
So we spoke about healthcare, we spoke about utilization of supports. I really wanted to also tackle the support for entrepreneurship in rural communities. And it's really no surprise that when the pandemic hit, funding was one of the biggest struggles that several entrepreneurs face, especially in rural communities, to ensure that they're able to stay afloat and hope for sustaining their business or organization pre and post pandemic. I'm not sure which side we're on, if we're on post pandemic or still in the pandemic, depends on who you ask, I guess. So I'm very curious to hear, as you're all in different rural communities, what have been perhaps one of the biggest hurdles for rural entrepreneurs, or even yourselves as rural entrepreneurs, especially in this course that we're on of access, and how do you feel should be tackled as it relates to your community? So perhaps Shanna, I can start with you.
Yes. Well, I know that, well, when the pandemic hit, for myself, I was actually on maternity leave. I had just had my child, so I didn't wasn't looking at having that kind of access because I was in a completely different mode at that time. But a lot of entrepreneur colleagues I know were able to get certain types of grants, but I know it didn't span exactly what they needed. And I think, I mean, we hear that from everywhere. So I think one of the things too is that, you know, we all talk, excuse me, you often talk about, you know, the support from the communities. And like Doreen said, the communities in the rural areas, we really are tight knit. We come together, you know, we shop local, we help each other out. And I think that's one of the things that helped at that too. So I think it's also, it comes back to the numbers, right? So our population is not as dense as in an urban center. So when you're looking at like the kind of the recovery coming back from that, or people coming back to, spend the money, it's not necessarily there as much as maybe in other places where there's more of a dense population, such as in the urban centers. So what we're seeing, and again, this might be similar to other urban centers, but a lot of say restaurants are different, especially in the food industry. They've lost a lot of staff. They're not open early in the morning. It's really shifted the way that they do business, and just having access to students, even like people that are taking on smaller shifts. So it's changed that kind of landscape of even the kind of businesses that are open and that are available. So I think that some kind of granting or some of the funding that's there needs to look at that kind of specific area. And then maybe Doreen, you might know more than I do of maybe what's available now, because as an artist, the grants that I look for are a little bit different. Even though I'm an artist entrepreneur, it's a little bit different than other businesses. But I know that, just again, a lot of times when we look at grants, it kind of looks at things from an urban perspective, like an urban center perspective. And because populations are just so different, and you don't necessarily have, you can't, you just, there's just not that density there to be able to make up that whatever is missing. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but that's kind of what I've seen and what I've felt and what I've heard. Um, and just what was available. And I think whatever flows down from the grants to be able to help out, it always looks at what the population is. So it's kind of that double-edged sword. So if the population is not high enough, then those grant monies are not as high, but they still have the same costs, or even sometimes more, depending on, again, we're talking about where they are, if the cost of different things to get it out there is more. So I think it's, those things need to be considered when they're looking at funding to be able to do that recovery.
Yeah, Shanna, thanks for pointing that out. I think it's such an important thing to look at as far as funding is concerned. And that's sometimes, to your point, it is a double-edged sword, right? So it's more like, well, this is an inclusive practice that, for example, if you're looking at it from an urban versus rural perspective, that majority of the funding is going towards trying to sustain organizations and businesses in urban centers. Is it an equitable practice, and what does it look like from a rural perspective, and how much focus has there really been put out there to ensure that rural communities are part of that inclusive economic recovery, right? So absolutely, thank you. Doreen, we'll go over to you.
Thanks. It's interesting. I heard in a lot of what you said, Shanna, is also couched for me in the barriers that are created because of gendered roles. And we can go and have a whole hour plus on the gendered mindsets around entrepreneurship. And to me, entrepreneurship is often it's with language that is possibly more masculine. It often will employ just terminology and imagery that don't resonate with women. So a lot of women, what I saw in those gendered roles, approached the pandemic specifically very much from the mindset of, oh my God, what is happening to our community? There was at that time, I was doing work for our local Community Futures Development Corporation, ACC Futures, and I saw more women than men come through our doors because by the time they got to us, they were desperate. They had some of the barriers they encountered. The very early on supports were based on the number of employees that you have and the certain level of sales and how much rent you pay and so on. And a lot of women-led and women-owned businesses tend to be smaller because women are carrying heavier mental labor load as well as caregiving loads. They are less likely to employ people. And that's not because we don't want to. It's because, and I'm going to call a spade, we really don't relish oftentimes being mothers to employees as well. I mean, I see it all the time. It's like, oh my God, I don't think I can be responsible for someone else's mortgage or rent payment. There's that barrier a little bit. So when it comes to gendered roles, it carries through in entrepreneurship very, very deeply. As well, what happened is because women often have caregiving roles, etc., the partner's job, occupation, or business takes precedence. It often brings more money home. And there's a choice to be made. If the kids can't go to school, or there could be labor disruptions, now it's not just a pandemic, then it's mom's business that suffers and gets put on the back burner. So I feel that in rural areas, we are faced with a higher degree of gendered stuff when it comes to social roles. And it goes back exactly to what Jackie was saying. It's the ideas. There might be more progressive thinking in urban centers than we see in conservative small town Canada. So, and I'll leave it at that because I could just like blah, blah, blah for a lot longer. Yeah, Jackie.
Doreen, that's exactly what I was going to speak to. I wanted to talk specifically about this notion that a woman's business is a side hustle. Do you know what I mean? And that we can and have to make it work around our partner's sort of anchor salary in this sort of heterosexual scenario. And I think that was sort of born out, as you say, during the pandemic, because and I totally appreciate your language of choice. So many didn't have a choice, right? Like, so it was just like, kids are home, you're staying home. Like, that's that, right? Like, unbelievable the efficient, effective, powerful women, right? That were just like, oh, okay, I guess I have to do childcare, try to run my business, keep everybody's mental health in some kind of equilibrium and not completely freak the F out, right? So much of that is just so wrong and an expression of sort of the patriarchal construction of our relationships, right? The pandemic just laid that bare, right? And so I was involved, just like you, with a Community Futures. It was a program for women who basically were just trying to stay afloat in their businesses. And I did that with a collaborator, and she did the business side of things in terms of business skills and stuff like that, like trying to keep them afloat. And together we did an emotional component, right? And that is the piece that's so often ignored in the business world, and why women don't sort of self-identify as having more than a side hustle or being more than like a boss babe or whatever, because it's just not habitable for women, right? It's just not a habitable space for women. And that really, really sucks. And it just speaks to all of the things that you were talking about in terms of why our businesses look small, why they look, single person headed. I mean, most of the time we're just trying to get out of toxic work environments. if we're honest, right? Again, I could go on and on and on too. So I'll just leave it there.
I so appreciate what you're saying, Jackie, because it's absolutely, and I'm like, I put in the comments, I know the viewers probably can't see that, but it's like, if there's a few terms that I intensely dislike, one of them is boss babes. It's like, really? Come on, girl boss, all that stuff. We're done with that. It infantilizes the whole language around women business ownership. One additional thing that I'll put out there, and I have the statistics to back it up in our area. I don't know where you come from in your own communities, Jackie and Shanna, but I know in North Glengarry, for instance, where I am, the level of education across the board is below that of the province. We have fewer college, university educated folks. It's not because we have stupid people who live here. It just has been more of a way of life. You don't necessarily need a PhD to run a farm, yet you're running a very essential business, and it's big business. Having said that, one of the barriers that I notice to entrepreneurship supports is the level of language and complexity when it comes to those applications. I have just recently been helping out with the My Main Street program, which North Glengarry is part of. And I'm very much considering lodging an official complaint on, I have a marketing degree and a master's degree in entrepreneurship, and I struggled to put some of those forms together. I mean, I'm like, what? And it's not because, and I could do it in French and in English, and in some other programs, the level of French also was ridiculous. It was so not even adapted to our environment here in Eastern Ontario and French Ontario. It was ridiculous. It was language that most French-speaking people would look and say, what the heck is that? So the barriers are cultural, they're linguistic, they are education-based as well. And it would serve the entire province, the entire country so much more if we could just simplify the language. Like, why make it so complicated? It would benefit everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Two things that I really gathered, like one of which, Shanna, you and Jackie illustrated, was in relation to the roles, and even Doreen, you alluded to it as well, the gender roles, and how oftentimes, to your point, Jackie, there is no choice, and that really showed during the pandemic, where women, women and BIPOC entrepreneurs who were either entrepreneurs themselves or who were laid off, needed to make that decision to be stay-at-home parent, because daycares weren't available, daycares were closed. Hi, do you have something to say too? And there was absolutely no choice, even though the passion perhaps was there to kickstart back up. But several businesses didn't kickstart back up, especially those that were women run, did not have the option to start back up. So that on its own was a concern. And then to your point, Doreen, the application process, who made these decisions to create such a hinderous process, right? And who's this serving? And how can those processes be refined and reviewed, and ensure that it's a very simplified process? And this even goes for entrepreneurs who have disabilities. the application process is incredibly strenuous. It is not an inclusive process. It's not accessible. So who is being held accountable, right? It's all these concerns here. So since we're in this subject matter of big hurdles for entrepreneurs, so one of the things that I really wanted to ask you folks, and it's something that we, each of you pointed out, is what is that disproportional impact between rural versus urban entrepreneurs? And you did highlight a few things in terms of funding, in terms of grants, in terms of density of the population. So I would like to kind of take a deeper dive and dissect it a bit further in terms of, so that people can really envision, like, what is that disproportional impact when you're thinking about rural versus urban entrepreneurs? So Shanna, I guess if you can start with this, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Well, like I mentioned, just like the land size of where we are and population. So all those things, whenever there's demographics are growing, right? I mean, your towns are growing. Like we're in small villages. We have a couple cities, but our cities are like 10,000 people. So when you think of a city, Ottawa's like what, 1 million now? That's not the kind of city that we have close by. So these are all dependent on how many people are living here, taxes and whatnot. So when you're an entrepreneur, and where do entrepreneurs get together, network, and such things, we have great businesses that open up their doors for us to come to their places, to network. We can go to restaurants, but one of the things that we don't have is infrastructure. There are actual buildings that we don't have to gather. And now we're talking about entrepreneurship, but I mean, even if we're talking about sport and art, we are very lucky to have 3 cultural centers, but there's 3 over 2,000 square, what is it, 200,000? I know I went to go, yeah, 2,000 square kilometers. 2,000 square kilometers is really the size of Prescott Russell. And there's a cultural center in Hawkesbury, there's one in Embrun, and there's a small one in Vankleek. And they are gems in our community. But they we have a lot more people. We have 90,000 people, and in all these different communities we have 8 municipalities. So just to kind of lay it out how we're dispersed, and if we don't have one in each community, like sometimes, yes, people go from one community to the next, but again, this is cultural. A lot of people want things in their communities. They want things that they can be proud of, that they have built. So one of the things that's being built over the last few years, and one that's still being built right now, are sports complexes. Now, when you think, okay, a sports complex, somebody in an urban center would be like, well, everybody has a sports complex. Nope. Not everybody does. Not everybody has a community center either. So that's very telling. You don't have a community center. Where do people gather? Like, where do people go to meet up? Well, now, thankfully, with the internet, we can put out calls, we can find each other, and then we find a restaurant where we can meet up. But besides that, it's not like, back in the day people would meet up on, the church steps, and maybe some people still do, but that's not everybody's reality. That's not everybody's, network or, place of gathering. So there's very much a problem just with infrastructure, with having places to be able to have those experiences, and just have the, happenstance meet up where you're somewhere and you meet someone else. Now everything has to be planned. If you're going to meet with someone, you have to plan it out, and we don't have public transportation. Now, that said, there is a program that had started with United Counties where there is a bus that goes around. Again, we're very fortunate to have this, but it's limited in the hours. It's really much more, I would say for the elderly, or people to get around from, say, town to town, if they have appointments, medical appointments, go get prescriptions. Maybe some people are using it for work, but I know that the last information that had come out, and somebody can correct me in this has probably changed a little bit, was that it wasn't being used for that. So, I mean, I've seen, the buses kind of there, and they wait for people. I don't know how much they're being used, but we are not a community that has grown up on taking city buses. It's just not part of our culture. Like, we've taken school buses because we live out in like county roads and you can't walk to school. You really need to take a school bus. But that's the extent of kind of public transportation we've taken. And I don't know how many times I've had people like say, okay, well, I'll take a taxi, say Christmas is around the corner. Yes, we have Opération Nez Rouge. Sorry, I can't remember what it is in English. I am Francophone as well, so that's a part of the conversation too that'll come up, I'm sure. Um, so people be like, well, take a taxi. Well, a taxi could cost you $80 to go from one town to the next. It's just absolutely ludicrous. And it's just because of the sheer, space between the different towns. And these towns, when they were settled, when people settled here, they settled as small towns. They weren't meant to be very, very big. And now things are growing, which I mean is great because it's bringing in opportunity. It's bringing in those tax dollars we need to create things. And we're running into other problems too because we have like one road, one main road that was built and everything's built around that main road. So now we have congestion too. So, there's all these things that we consider around times of the year when things get really busy and then all these places that we have get booked up really, really quickly because everybody's booking at the same time. So it's not like there's not a lot of options. We're very, grateful for the options we do have, but there's just, when it comes to option and choice, it gets a little bit limited. So, yeah, I'd have to say that, yeah, about that. Someone else can maybe jump in about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Shanna. Doreen, if you wanted to, I saw you're unmuted, so I'll just have you carry.
Thank you. I think one of the biggest differences between urban and rural recovery is definitely to address our staff shortages is the attractiveness of coming to a rural area if you're a new Canadian or a person of color. A BIPOC person would not necessarily feel possibly at ease in some of our small towns. We are still very much white bread, hate to say it. And the mentalities still have a lot of catching up to do. Whereas if you're in an urban area, there is by nature more diversity, and you don't blink if you see a person of color walking down Main Street, but they still do around our small towns. And I think that impedes the recovery because we need to change hearts and mindsets and views in order to be more inclusive. We have a lot of work to do diversity-wise.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up, Doreen. I can certainly relate to this. I come from a very small, it was then a village and now it's a town in Nova Scotia. And we were one of two Indian families. So I can certainly relate to feeling like a marker in a village and not having access to services to support me as a child who was newly immigrated into a community. And also going through kind of that cultural identity too, right? In terms of how am I going to navigate a community where I'm not represented, right? And the mindset, of course, is why are we here? Why can't we go to, for example, if I even said Halifax, which is more diverse than Truro, I should say, those kind of spaces that have access to support services, whereas Truro did not have any, right? So thank you for pointing that out. I'm very cognizant of time, so I wanted to bring this back up a little bit and talk a little bit about the labor market, right? We spoke about entrepreneurship. We spoke about, access to navigation. I think some of them have, some of the hurdles have certainly come up in terms of transportation, right? So can we talk a little bit about that in terms of the labor market within your own rural community? And is it where we were, let's say when the pandemic hit March 2020, compared to where we're at right now? How do you feel we're doing in terms of that economic recovery and really pushing forward and ensuring that more and more people are seeing employment as a priority? Do you feel that people are moving out of the rural communities and going more towards urban communities to seek employment? Or what have you seen or heard in your rural communities? Doreen, I can see that you have some thoughts there. I'll start with you.
I don't always want to be that person to start, but yeah, I don't have a good poker face. Actually, we've seen a big influx. We are not, because of the pandemic, we're not bleeding people. We are actually, I don't know what the numbers are, but we're seeing more of an influx. The challenge may be the type of influx. They tend to be, interestingly, I guess, boomer or late Gen Xers for the most part, who have cashed out of urban areas and are coming here and finding affordability and livability. And they're looking for different services and different retail outlets and so on that are actually very much feeding our small businesses and women-led businesses. And from that point of view, I love it. The other part of why we're so attractive as well, never mind affordability, has been the fact that we're so close to nature and we have a lot of trails, etc. What that's done, however, is this influx has pushed out a lot of less fortunate, less privileged folks from the area. And there is kind of that urban come from away, how dare you, bump me out of my, of affordable housing and so on. So there's that tug of war that's happening. And from a labor market, what we're seeing is now, because our internet has improved, we are seeing more young professionals be able to work from home, and it is giving them flexibility in their life and so on. So I would say right now we're probably on more the winning end of the recovery from that aspect than we are in the losing end, I would say. But that's very subjective from my lens and my circles. I wouldn't be able to back it up with data at this point.
Thank you, Doreen. Jackie.
I'm not sure I have anything like very meaningful to say about this. I think that we're still struggling with a labor shortage in this area. There's lots of people who are hiring, and I have my like pet theory about like how the pandemic kind of blew up the world and everybody was like, oh well, nothing really matters. And that may be being a good thing, I don't know, but I don't have anything meaningful to contribute.
Shanna, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I echo what Jackie's saying. I mean, and from what I've seen and what I was saying earlier, just the sheer fact that, businesses are opening later, there's still a labor shortage. We're seeing that. And what I'm hearing too, and again, that this is anecdotal, is just people have this sense that they don't know where, say the youth have gone. They're like, what are they doing? Like, are they working elsewhere? Are they not wanting to work? Like what happened? And then some of the places that, kind of had certain kind of services, I feel like the service quality has gone down, kind of like, I don't know if the pool of people has gotten a lot smaller, and then, it's just they take who they can. And I mean, it's really something that I notice as it's quite jarring in certain instances. And it could be, because, like Jackie said, the world blew up and people are like, I don't care anymore. Like, I don't know, there's, and it could have to do with mental health as well. There's so many factors that are in that. But we're definitely seeing like a lot of signs where, hiring, and even places where you see a big turnaround. Usually it's like people aren't applying there. Could be also, in like my own personal theory is that they've seen that there's other ways to be able to do this, like work from home. And maybe some people have decided, I'm going to try and be an entrepreneur as well, work for themselves, having to look at how, we're talking about toxic environments, maybe whatever happened during the pandemic, they're getting out of it and finding that there are other options, because we are looking at our health more. We are looking at, being careful, the way, we're living our lives, just because of, how things have changed. So I think there's a lot of those different things happening. It'd be really interesting in a couple of years to see the literature that comes out about that, about kind of, I guess, the mental state and what's been happening, because something's happening. We just can't really put our finger on it. Well, I can't anyway.
Yeah, thanks so much, Shanna. I just wanted to point out, like, one of the biggest thing that's happening right now is the affordability, right? Like with the living wage. is the labor market actually reflecting based on where we are going right now economically in terms of food prices, gas prices? Is it even worth for me to apply for the position if this is what the salary or the hourly wage is, right? There's also that conversation of, I can't afford to have this job because I'll be in negative hundreds or thousands based on what this position is offering me, and the labor market isn't catching up based on what the existing living wage is at the moment. Resulting in what's happening right now with the strikes that's happening with CUPE and things like that. So yeah, thank you, Doreen. I feel like you wanted to add something to that. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I do think we're, again, it's anecdotal. That, I like to back things up with research, and I don't have that at our fingertips yet. At the same time, when it comes to affordability, because our housing prices are much less, and people have land, they can grow their own food, there is more support and cultural acceptance, almost, never mind acceptance, expectation that you'll have, well, you have a garden. Like, you got to be growing at least your own tomatoes and cucumbers when you live in the country. Otherwise, what's wrong with you, right? So there's a little bit more of that. And to circle back to, like, last night, we had Business Sisters had one of our networking events in Castleman. It was 10 to 8, and a business sister of mine and I were trying to go and have a debriefing drink. Well, I'm sorry, we went to 4 different places, and the only one that was still open at 10 to 8 was McDonald's. So here we were, right? And even then, there were pretty skeleton staff. So what has happened, however, like all the smaller independents, when we were reading in the press about quiet quitting, well, entrepreneurs are quiet quitting. They're like, in the restaurant business, you make your money Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And if you stay open, and maybe Sunday brunch, right? If you stay open on Monday, Tuesday, you lose what you've earned. And God knows that in the restaurant business, if you make 10% bottom line profit, you're at the top of all restaurants, okay? So there's slim margins. And at the end of the day, entrepreneurs are picking and choosing when they want. They're finally, I believe, giving themselves permission to prioritize their mental health, their physical health, and their wellness. I think it's happening.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and thank you. I'm also seeing that here as well in terms of where things were and where things are now in terms of having intentional business hours set. Not because they don't, they don't really care if money is coming in, but it's more so, to your point, is that mental health and the importance to disconnect and to actually have that genuine balance between work and life. So great point here. And I wanted to, this really beautifully segues into a question I have for Jackie. As it relates to your work with empowerment to resilience, and something that's we've kind of spoken about earlier is really about access to those support services for mental health and wellness, and more so even for parents and for women, for mompreneurs, right? And that has been an ongoing concern. Has been raised repeatedly. However, not much has been done to help to implement something in rural communities, and it has to be done by individuals or communities or through allies, right? And this is why I'm so excited to ask you this question, Jackie, in terms of sharing a little bit about perhaps what you've heard in the work that you've done with empowerment for resilience, to resilience, and what was your why behind launching such an important space as well.
Well, thank you so much for asking me that question. The answer originates in when I had my daughter. So I had my daughter, and I was a 36-year-old academic woman, and I thought, I had it nailed. I was going to be great. I had like the perfect pregnancy. So of course I was going to do it wonderfully. I did not anticipate having severe postpartum depression and anxiety. And then on top of that, I did not anticipate not having the supports in my area to be able to help me. And that was obviously a very scary time, very terrifying time in terms of, like, what do I do? Like, there are people, right? There's the health unit, there's my midwife, there's, but nobody really knew how to help, right? They didn't have the experience, they didn't have the exposure. And, the best people could do was recommend I go an hour away in either direction kind of thing, to possible support groups that might exist, of course, with my new infant. So that was going to be super easy. So my trajectory really is around, like, why aren't we having these conversations? Like, why, as a woman who studied gender and sexuality at a graduate level, right? Why did I have a baby and then find out about postpartum depression and anxiety, right? Like, why is that a thing? And then why, in God's name, is no one talking about it? Like, why are we all pretending that we're fine? Because having a kid is not fine. There's nothing fine about it, right? And bless you if you had a magical experience. I'm not jealous at all. But like, we need to be having these conversations. And so so I just put it online, right? Like, I put my experience online. That created a moms group on Facebook. I like to call the moms group that doesn't suck, because most moms groups suck really hard. Yeah, they're just places of judgment and shame, and mine is not. So feel free to join me in Mummy Voices on Facebook. And then that just slowly became me actually, doing the work I was doing in Mummy Voices, like, as a paid job, and I have so many interesting, like, things to talk about in terms of, like, how I didn't mind doing it volunteer for years, right, on Mummy Voices. And then when I started thinking about monetizing it, I was like, oh, I can't possibly monetize it, right? Like, that's not something I can do, So that's a whole interesting, coming into the understanding of yourself as an entrepreneur and what that means and what it looks like, and then how to walk sort of very delicate lines between sort of, providing help in the community and also not taking advantage, because no good help exists. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah, again, I could go on and on, but is there anything else you'd like me to follow up on that?
Yeah, no, first, I'm incredibly in awe by your story and the way that it came around. It's interesting how things unravel, and it takes personal experience to go in the direction that we, are so fondly going towards. So I'm actually very curious to perhaps hear a little bit more about things that you've witnessed from supporting others through Empowering to Resilience. In relation to supports for moms and parents. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that as well, and the work that you've done, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that the core of my work, I'm a sociologist, so I'm very clear that I'm not a clinician, but I'm very capable of providing support and guidance, right, for women and mothers who want to actually sort of live their lives again, right? And not live their lives in service to their family. And so that's what I see a lot of, right? I see a lot of women not having any self-compassion for themselves because they have been told and they have internalized that they should look after everyone around them first, so that they can then get whatever crumbs of the pie are left, right? And so a lot of my work is around, we have to take care of ourselves. We have to be in the driver's seat of our own lives, because this trajectory that so many women are on is just miserable, right? They, usually women come to me when they're overwhelmed, when they're so resentful, when they want to leave, when they, when they raise their head up after, raising small children and say, what is this prison that I've built for myself? Right. So that's what I see, right? I see women trying to cope with absolutely everything. And in the heterosexual scenario, I often see women who are doing that all on their own because their partners go to their job and that's enough, right? And so again, seeing the articulation of oppression in relationship, right? And women not being necessarily able to say, no, right? This is not the way that my life is going to look. This is not the way that things are going to go because this is horrible.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I feel like it's very important to echo that and to amplify those voices, right? Those concerns. And as a way of saying we need more support in this space let's talk more about this. Let's normalize these conversations. Let's ensure that these stigmas are removed. And the same goes for, I believe I spoke with you and, even looking at it from a perspective of not enough conversation over miscarriages or pregnancy loss, right? Let's normalize those conversations and ensure we're creating those safe spaces and healing circles so that we're able to provide those spaces of support when you're feeling at your loneliest, right? So admire what you do, and I'm really, really excited to see where this journey goes for what you've created on your own out of the darkest space that you've been in, and how it's flourished so far. So I really appreciate you sharing your story. I'm looking at the time. I could go on and on with this conversation, but I really wanted to end this conversation, perhaps an ask from you. So having heard of everything that you've had to say, and I'm excited to hear about what others have to say when they're listening to this conversation, but what is perhaps the one thing that you would like people to take away from this, or even perhaps even action out when you're looking at it from a perspective of rural access? So Doreen, if I can start with you.
Well, actually, I think Jackie touched upon the concept of having conversations. And Shanna also brought up getting together. Again, I'm probably a little bit on the high from the event that we had last night, but I know how much it changes how we feel and how we connect and how we can overcome and gain resilience. It's interesting, Jackie, we have to touch base offline because I did my thesis on entrepreneurial resilience and looking at ecosystems. And to me, when you are able to deliberately curate your ecosystem and have people who are there to support you and sometimes challenge you a little bit, we do need kind of that tug of war, that tension a little bit when it comes to support and challenge. And what it means to me in advancing the cause, if you will, it's creating conversations. And it's not about having a guru or government or some sort of overarching body. Very often it's individual to individual, figuring it out. And as a community, we're just there to make people aware that the tools exist, that the resources exist. And if they don't, we create them, which is what I think is fabulous, what you've done, Jackie, and what Shanna is doing as well with her art and her classes. So for me, it's creating space and time to have those conversations.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Doreen. Jackie.
I just want to say, I just want to echo that, Doreen. I love that so much. I think of myself as a disruptor. I like to be disruptive in spaces. I'm disruptive online. It's just like it's what I need to be, and it's who I've always been. And I think that once I stepped firmly into those shoes and said, okay, this is who I've always been, like this is my role, this is my job. Because when you have the conversation, when you say the thing, people are often just like, oh, thank God. God, somebody said something. Yeah, disrupt.
Love it. Awesome. Thanks, Jackie. Shanna.
Oh yes, I love it too. I mean, there's always a reason how things bring us together, the people at the table, right? I know we'll definitely have to connect after because I'm listening to you ladies speak about stuff and always learning more about your trajectory, Doreen. Very interesting. And yes, disrupting. And one of the things Doreen said, creative, and I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about what is it really, how to synthesize all this. We're really creative in the rural sector, right? Because when we see that there's a need, well, we go out and we create whatever it is to kind of, address that need. There's a lot of very innovative and a lot of innovation, even though there's a lot of need. So I think like that resilience is there. So one of the things that I would love is to consider to include us at that table. I think whatever decisions have to happen about around granting, about how things are going, make sure that there's a voice from that area, from those diverse kind of cultures coming from there, from francophones as well, to not just have like a token, like, okay, well, we have someone from Renfrew, we have someone for Ottawa, it's Eastern Ontario. No, make sure that you go out into these small communities and find maybe your disruptors that are there that are going to come to the table and say how things are really going. Because just like, Jackie was saying, she saw a need and she created around that need. I say, as myself, as an artist, sorry, I'm saying we really need to chat about this because we're talking about moms. One of the things that I had wanted to connect with other moms is that I developed a workshop to have moms come and speak about their experience of being mothers during the pandemic. And I was very fortunate to have a grant that allowed me to do that last year. And just to be able to create that space, to create that togetherness, and to create that conversation so that we can talk about those things that we don't usually have the chance to talk about. So that's why I'm saying, we're very creative in finding ways to bring ourselves together, because if it's not already in existence, well, you know what? It just kind of sparks that fire in some of us. We're there, and even if we're out here and you may not know about it happening, there's definitely stuff, sparks all over in these urban areas, rural areas, sorry, waiting to just have that chance to be at the table, to bring that and to share that, and to make sure that what is happening is being amplified and being heard.
Yeah, such an excellent point, Shanna, is really recognizing who's at the table at these conversations and who's not, especially if it impacts them the most, right? So I love that conversation about really ensuring that it isn't, to your point, it's not tokenism, but it's an intentional movement towards inclusive practices and equitable practices as well. So I mean, I can have this conversation for hours, but I'm very lucky at the time and we're over. I am so thankful, and I'm very privileged to have the chance to facilitate this conversation virtually. So I want to thank each and every one of you so much, to the bottom of my heart, for saying yes to this very important discussion. Obviously there are so many other factors that we can discuss. It's not the end after this conversation. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the connections that happen amongst the three of you, and seeing what unravels afterwards. And I also just want to thank Erin and Agatha, who have been behind the scenes listening to this conversation, and really demonstrating that intentional support and allyship to ensure that this conversation happens. So I'm really thankful for you both as well. So having said that, have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. And I cannot wait to see where the things happen next year. And I'm really looking forward to the unveiling of what happens in 2023. So thank you so much to each and every one of you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.